Hey, thanks for having me, NDU. This is not my normal audience. I generally come prepared to represent civil society, small business, the hacker and researcher community, and I'm usually representing that toward a Homeland Security or a corporate audience or maybe an international internet governance kind of forum. So excited to be presenting in front of you, and I want to thank. I'm kind of sandwiched in between some fantastic speakers, but Jim Langevin, great all-time cybersecurity supporter, and I see him at all kinds of fascinating places, and he's doing a lot of great work. So to hear him talk in this audience was enjoyable for me. And then Mark Montgomery with the Cyberspace, the Solarium Commission report. That's just a Herculean task. So. What you're going to hear is probably a lot of what they had to say kind of regurgitated in a slightly different way. I've got some basic slide deck here for you, and what I'm hoping to do is get you thinking a little bit differently, and then I'm really hoping to go to a question and answer, because I always get the most out of the Q&A session when I'm in the audience, and so I'm hoping to do the same for you. So let's kick this off. Let's see if my slide deck moves. It does. Okay. So my first thought here is around complexity. We heard this mentioned in a couple of different ways. And so I'm a big picture thinker. I'm a generalist. And so I'm thinking, okay, we started from an agrarian society. And as we started to organize ourselves into structured societies, we moved into an industrial era where really what we're doing is repetitive tasks in an automated fashion. This is the era of the Model T. And this created value. And it started to create specialization, industrial specialization. And this leads to the information age. And now we're just not repetitively stamping out parts or assembling a better car engine. We're handling information flows, assigning values, time of information, telegraph, wireless telephone. And the overriding principle during this era is specialization. So for example, I've been doing this for a long time, and in my beginnings, me and probably 4 or 5 people, we could probably take over the world in the sense of the telecom systems are pretty simple, the operating systems are pretty simple, networking was pretty simple. It was possible to have 4 or 5 people and within that group have a really solid understanding of how it all works. 30 years later, no way. You need a team of 20 or 30 people just to tell you what's going on with Node.js or what went wrong on your website. It's really specialized, and this is for a number of reasons. One is economies of scale, efficiency, speed, but it's also, if you think about it, in your career, whatever your careers may be, you've probably had to specialize to get ahead, to make a name for yourself, right? Publish or perish. You have to be known as that one guy that knows that one edge case. And so there's a number of competing forces making us specialize. Well, that's good for our careers and it's good for the economy, but it has a side effect. It leads to this complexity that becomes kind of overwhelming. And the issue here is, through complexity theory, we know that complex systems fail in unpredictable ways. They just do. So as we build these complex systems, you have to internalize, you have to get okay with knowing that your system or the systems that you depend on one day may fail. And we have to be okay with that. And when I was at the Chief Security Officer for ICANN, we used to have these pictures on the wall. I'll show you this first one here. Is the network, the first internet network, the ARPA network, September 1969. And I tried to find the original source of these pictures, but they're gone out of business. So the best I found are the pictures I took of the pictures. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is how quickly the network gets complex. Right? 1969, September, December, it's got a couple extra nodes. By 75, the ARPA network is spanning the United States, coast to coast. And you might recognize some military bases there or some university names. You can even see a link going off to Hawaii. There's some going off to Europe there, London. I figured maybe some of the map geeks here in the audience will enjoy this. Okay, now we're into the Usenet. This is just the news network delivering our news back then. See, we're pretty much into Europe now, and the network is growing. We'll jump forward a little bit. I'm sorry, jump backwards a little bit, and you'll notice that the routes the network's taking basically follows the old telegraph routes. It's just with different kind of data. In 2007, there was an internet city connection map done, and you can see by the density of traffic. You don't see the borders of the United States. You can just determine the borders by looking at the density of traffic in 2007. Just jump forward a handful of years, 2011. Right? You can't even make out the country is just a giant white spot. So our maps are starting to fail us. So we try to invent new kinds of maps. This was an attempt, I think, in like 2015 to create a different, the Internet Mapping Group was trying to create a new way of visualizing the Internet. Google has one where they try to show you based on size. Since they're a company and they're obsessed with size, you know, you look at this and you go, ooh, Google, that's really cool. Look how big they are. I look at this and go, look at the concentration of power. Look at those attractive targets. You know, look at all eggs in one basket. And so the failure modes of these complex systems are impossible to predict. And we have to be okay with that. You have to be able to tell your leadership or your board that our network is going to fail, potentially, and I'm not going to be able to tell you how. Or maybe it fails, and you can say it might take an inordinate amount of effort, and we may never know exactly why it failed. And we have to be okay with it, right? That's the trade-off we're making. We get these fantastic complex systems that give us all new capabilities, and we have to be okay with a little bit of uncertainty, fragility, and failure. Okay, now my next thought, people generally ask me about who are the actors in this space. And this is a big, broad stroke. I know there's a lot of specialists here, but bear with me. I generally say there's a handful of actors. One, nation states are seeking secrets. And in this sense, I'm saying it's traditional espionage, right? It's the United States trying to verify that another country isn't violating the terms of a treaty, or stealing the secrets from one of our companies, or verification of some other fact, right? It's a traditional espionage role. Nation states have printing presses. We're not after the money. Organized crime don't have the printing presses. They want the money. They don't care about secrets. Secrets are hard to monetize, right? We just heard a fantastic summation of how ransomware is driving innovation and security in enterprises. Well, that's right. Companies are at the mercy of criminal groups that all they try to do is figure out how to make the most amount of money for the least amount of risk. And as they optimize that, their supply chain, their vertical integration of that kind of crime, it's having an impact on the rest of society. We've got protesters who generally want attention, and this could be anything. It could be a human rights group, animal rights group, it could be anything. They're trying to draw attention to their cause, for good or for bad. It could be with misinformation, disinformation, but they're seeking eyeballs. And finally, the area I mostly populate is the hackers and research area. You could also put academics, but essentially, these are groups that want knowledge. They want to know, how do things work? Why do they work? How do I break them? How do I fix them? And if you look at what the byproduct of this group is, they generally discover new classes of vulnerabilities, previously unknown, or maybe only known in certain very small classified spaces. Expose poor product security. And this drives companies crazy. I mean, when we have talks at DEF CON and they're saying, here's how to bypass the $1,000 physical lock with a paperclip, it drives companies crazy. But the byproduct is we as consumers now know how to bypass this lock. This is not a quality a lock that we could depend on. And just because the manufacturer had managed to keep it quiet for so long doesn't necessarily mean that the criminals didn't already know about it. And that causes this third effect, right? Spurring a public debate. This is a transparency argument, essentially, saying that this group informs policymakers and the public. And what we see is the criminals and governments don't do this. It's not in their advantage. It's not to their interest. So, for example, why would criminals reveal that they know how to get past that lock? Or a new zero-day vulnerability they're using? Or the government faces all kinds of potential legal challenges if they start outing bugs in other people's stuff. So what we see is out of the total cosmos of actors in the market, these hackers, researchers, academics, these are the ones that are sort of like the white blood cells. We're the antibodies, really informing public discourse. And this leads to better policy outcomes, right? They tend to focus on what is possible and what is practical, a little less on what's theoretical. They want to be able to get their hands on something and do it, prove it. They're curious about how security really works, and not just what you were told by the manufacturer. And the important thing I find, what's really refreshing for me, is you have to be able to admit when you're wrong. This community, when you hear a healthy conversation among members in this community, they're constantly saying, I'm not sure, or you need to verify, or I was wrong and the other person was right. And this leads to kind of reduces the ego quotient in the room and leads to better conversations that are more sort of outcome driven and less, patting yourself on the back. And so what happens here in the area that I find myself operating in is you're trying to inform policymakers, decision makers, the real risks, or at least the risks that you know of, in sort of a neutral way. And what's going on here is that I'm not worried, well, it bothers me, but my goal is to get the best information into the hands of the decision makers. And then if they make a bad decision, at least it was a well-informed bad decision. What drives me crazy is when policymakers make bad decisions because they had bad information. And so I can't solve the whole equation. I'm just trying to get them the best numbers possible, and then hopefully they're capable of running it to the rest of the finish line. New thought here, hacking is going to happen. It's going to happen whether you like it or not, whether you've criminalized it or not. So you may as well take advantage of that fact and get the most out of it for you or your country or your policy objectives. I've got a couple of suggestions here. And this is an area that the United States has done pretty well in. I'd say the United States, in Europe a bit, but I think that the United States pretty much is in the lead. And this is to pass laws that focus attention on critical technologies, make it okay to hack certain technologies. We innovated with bug bounty programs, getting more eyeballs on potential problems. And a lot of cyber competitions were born out of capture the flag contests and other cyber competitive events. And then you saw the United States really kind of through the NCCDC and other competitions really take and run with this. Now a lot of countries, South Korea and Japan, a lot of other countries are doing this now, but it's a total package of trying to encourage and foster a positive hacking environment. To that first point, the legal point, I hold this one dear to my heart. This is the DMCA 2015 exemption. there were 6 exemptions made that year, good for 4 years. And exemption number 3 made it legal for security research to hack election security systems. And this is what made the DEF CON vote hacking village possible. Right? Year 1 it passed and we didn't really realize it. By year 2, I was on eBay buying every election system I could buy, every voting system I could. We brought it to DEF CON, and then we had the third-party experts descend upon this technology. Well, it previously had not been legal to do so. But thanks to this exemption, we could now get our hands on this technology, and that opened up a floodgate of research, new college courses on how to research the security of elections. So, I don't know if you've been following the news, but last week or a week and a half ago, the president tweeted something about the voting village, some video that NBC had shot at the voting village. And Representative Langevin was there at the very first year that this happened. And it was fantastic, just trying to understand the process. This has spurred a national debate. I bring out this example because it illustrates my point about what we're trying to do in the civil society is we're trying to draw attention to areas where government has not historically been able to, and the manufacturer of this voting equipment is never going to do this. And so it's up to these researchers to really draw the attention, and then society gets a benefit as a whole. I'd like to just say a little bit about almost every country in the world has an industrial policy except the United States. I think there's only a handful of countries that don't. And whenever I bring this up in the previous administration, and I would ask, why is this? And they'd say, well, it's not the American way. I'd say, okay, I've heard that answer before. If that's our answer, we should probably be promoting it. Right? We should have a whole plan on how we go forth to the public and we say, we're America and we don't have an economic industrial policy because. And we should get some credit for that. If we think we're doing this because it's beneficial to the country, we should promote that. But we were kind of dating the worst of both worlds. We weren't promoting it, and other countries assumed that we had one because they had one. And so under this administration, I think I've discovered the beginning of an actual industrial policy. And it started with the White House strategy on 5G. Right? And then you get some, and maybe you could argue before that, even they're testing the waters with Huawei. But now we've got the State Department's clean strategy. And from what I just heard from the last 2 speakers, I think this is the direction we're going. At DHS, I was on a subcommittee where we were talking about ICT, supply chain security, and our proposal, one of our proposals out of 5 was the recommendation of a supply chain sort of intelligence clearinghouse. And I think, and this was also a recommendation, or a permutation of this that was suggested in this Solarium, from the Solarium Commission. So I think we're at a point where all of these ideas are starting to collide, and we're starting to reach a critical mass. But when the United States was the sole leader in many technological areas, okay, hey, maybe we can get away with no policy. That's not the case anymore. We need a policy. And I really liked what I heard about having an overarching strategy instead of 30 different legislative attempts at creating a national strategy. Okay. This is probably something you hear a lot in your area, but in the civil society area, there's not that many people saying this. But really, the rule of law versus authoritarian systems. I view this is the battle of the next decade, I believe. And a lot will be determined in this arena. So for example, I'm sitting here right now, it's what time is it now? 4:15 in Singapore. Singapore is an interesting place because it sits in a very technological kind of pivotal location. If you look on a map, you'll see almost all of Southeast Asia's fiber traffic, packet traffic comes through Singapore. Why is that? Why not Malaysia or Indonesia or Thailand? And that's because Singapore has a secret weapon. It has rule of law. It's predictable. There's a Googleplex here. Amazon's got something here. Netflix has got something here. Everybody has a data center here. The Chinese just bought out a couple data centers because you have predictability and rule of law. And we should be maximizing our advantages. We should be definitely building a coalition, the rule of law. We can be democracies. We can respect each other's slightly different traditions around democracy. They all don't have to be the same, but we all have to agree that we're for rules. And we can draw a contrast to the other system, the Chinese dominant system of authoritarianism, because they really think they've got a winner. Right? They're trumpeting it in Africa, the ITU, and that's our adversary. Right? It's a clash of two ideas, rule of law versus authoritarian. And then you have a lot of countries that are going to get squeezed in the middle. Right? They're economically tied on a belt and road to China or some other reason, and they're going to have trouble picking. Right? The decision's going to get made for them, and we have to recognize that. Civil society plays a huge role in the rule of law countries. This is a lot of credibility comes from for a civilian elected government. Right? It's the population that confers the legitimacy. So just keep these points in mind. Multi-stakeholder versus multilateral. Right of the individual versus right of the state. And in this era, transparency is critical. Right? That's sort of the coin of the realm. I've talked about a little bit about the transparency around, say, a voting system or a lock or a vulnerability that a security researcher finds. But I remember maybe about 7 years ago, I was talking with someone at DHS, and I said, how come we don't name our enemies? Why are we not allowed as a government to name our enemies? We all know who's attacking us. The researchers know, my friends know, we all know, we just don't say it out loud. What's the deal? And again, I didn't get a very good answer. Interesting. Yes, I wonder why. And then over the next year and a half or 2 years, I noticed the administration started mentioning China more. Companies started mentioning China more. And once that happened, the dam broke. And now we could name our opponents. Now we could name Iran. Now we could name North Korea, right? And that all of a sudden informs the marketplace. That informs the CEOs that are doing business in China. It allows people to make supply chain decisions. But when we were treating this information as some sort of secretive thing, it was really affecting the decisions that were being made. I'm almost out of slides. Get your questions ready. So, my big takeaway here, though, is we must engage in civil society for multi-stakeholder credibility. And I have a small list here. I could go on and on. But what I mean here is I want to repeat the point that Mark was making about how the Chinese have really moved in and dominated a lot of these standards bodies. So when I was at ICANN, a lot of Chinese would show up. Chinese engineers from all the various companies. And it's a little unclear about really why they were participating at ICANN. Because inside China, they don't have civil society inside China. So it didn't quite make sense that they would be outside of their country. But really what they're doing is they're trying to learn how it works and trying to figure out where the pressure points are and where the levers are and what the other member states are interested in. What are the constituency groups interested in and how do they influence them? You see this at IETF. Back in the day, it was HP and IBM and Microsoft and Cisco, and all these engineers were there. All the early standards were made by Americans and Europeans. And then once they got what they wanted and the standards were sort of built, they kind of left to go make their money. And then the Chinese moved in. And I mean, it's not just companies. I mean, the United States, the government is the same way. When I was at ICANN, there's this one guy, Bobby Flame. Bobby Flame from the FBI. He was a hero. He was the one person from the government that was essentially showing up at all the meetings, writing reports and reporting back home. Where Other governments would send 5, 10 people. They would have whole teams that did nothing but manage and monitor what's happening in the IETF. Right? It's no big shocker that 5G standards advantaged China, and they were the first companies to take advantage of it. Right? So I'm totally repeating and totally supporting what was said previously. You must show up. You must have a national strategy to engage with civil society globally, because global problems and internet problems are connected. You don't get to have an internet problem and not have it be a global problem. And this means that when there is a problem, your frenemy or your enemy, you might have to work with. Right? If China's producing all the routers and there's a problem in a router, you're going to have to talk to them. You're going to have relationships, and you're going to have to participate. Another thing I'm a big believer of is international norms of behavior. I've heard other people talk about it, so I'm not going to repeat everything. But my big point here is that this is another giant differentiator with the rule of law countries. We need a sorting mechanism. How do we tell who's good and who's bad, or who's playing by the rules or who's not? Who's trustworthy, who isn't? We can apply this to companies, individuals, non-state actors, governments, whatever. Right? And so it was mentioned earlier, I was a commissioner on this, the GCSC Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. We were nonpartisan international representation, and all we focused on was the stability of cyberspace and what norms would be needed around that. And the part I find interesting is you start having these discussions, and sometimes governments think they're the only people in the room, and you have to explain, like, no, if you get into a conflict online, the operators of these networks will reconfigure their networks. Their job is to make money, and if there's a conflict on their network, that's not making them money, right? So you're having a fight, and the sand is shifting under your feet. The battlefield is changing while you're engaging in combat, and it's not going to be the same tomorrow. I'm a big believer of the norms of behavior, and there's hard norms and soft norms, and people get bogged down into, well, we really need a treaty. Now, what we really need to do is figure out who is expert at getting us close, a millimeter below the threshold of armed conflict repeatedly, over and over. And you identify them and you say, you know what, they're not good actors. They're constantly pushing the limits. And we have found civil society sometimes responds. Sometimes civil society de-peers them. We saw this with bulletproof hosting out of Russia. You anger the network providers too many times and they'll de-peer you. They just won't route. The government didn't have to tell them to do that. That was a contractual obligation. Okay, here's the second to last slide. My last slide is a thank you slide. So there's some tensions here. And I could go on, but essentially we have traded the centralization for centralization efficiency against a distributed resilient infrastructure. And it makes total sense in a market economy. So it also has some other side effects. Like I pointed out on that map with Google, you end up with some big market power. You end up with big centralization. Think of it this way. If you had 50,000 email providers, it'd be hard for the government to start regulating them all and investigating them all. And it'd also be harder for an adversary to break into all 50,000 and monitor everybody's email. But now I just need to get some employees at Microsoft, a couple employees over at Google and the Gmail group, right? Now all of a sudden, there's only a handful of email baskets I've got to get employees in or compromise. Same thing for DNS. I've got to get to Google or maybe Route 53 or Quad 9 or Cloudflare. That's not 50, it's 5. And the same thing for regulation. If I'm a foreign government, I'm the EU and I want to regulate, I don't know, data localization, I don't have to regulate 50,000 companies where the burden of regulation will be too high. I really only have to regulate a handful. And so it almost becomes like an attractive nuisance. And we're not really having these debates. The other thing is We don't create national champions and other countries do. We should probably talk about that at some point, if that's something we care about. So my idea here was to get you thinking. I'm really looking forward to the question and answer, and thank you for your time.